All right, so last week, we announced that we had finally posted the position for the lead pastor that we're searching for Cedar Valley Church. It's online, it's out there on a whole bunch of different pages, different local seminaries and Bible colleges. We invited you to join us in prayer for that, and we want to make this a congregational, fully open invite kind of thing that we want to be involved in. We need to be involved together in this, in prayer, this journey for our church. And so what we're going to be doing is every second Wednesday, starting this Wednesday, so this Wednesday evening, we are doing a prayer night here. So 7 o'clock to 8 o'clock, open invite for all of you to come out here, just here at the church in the lobby there. If there's a lot of us out here, just spending an hour together in prayer for God to be involved in this process God already knows who is going to be a lead pastor for this church. So for God to help us be aware of that, for God to help that person be aware of that, to go through the right channels, apply for it to be a smooth transition, for it to be the right timing, for this to work well. And ultimately, what we're looking here as a church, we've discerned our goal, our mission, our vision, our values as Cedar Valley Church, and we are looking for a lead pastor to guide us into that, to be a shepherd for the congregation here, and to help make sure that we are focusing on spreading the gospel in our specifically called way as a church here in the city of Mission. So join us for that Wednesday evenings, starting this Wednesday, 7 o'clock here at the church. Otherwise, I think it's an obligation for me to mention that it's Super Bowl Sunday. I titled this sermon, "Who's on Your Team?" but that is about as far as Super Bowl metaphors will go. I don't know anything about football, so that's it. That's all you're getting from me. But I do have a different story that hopefully it applies. It's really fun. So it's a good story. When I was in college, one of my college jobs, and for a little bit after college, I was a whitewater raft guide and instructor. Super fun job, high adrenaline, super exciting, and like with all outdoor adventure jobs, I got to work with a bunch of Aussies and Quebec Frenchies, got to meet people from all over the world. It was super fun. It paid horribly, but I got to go whitewater rafting like 300 times for free, I guess, so there's different trade-offs. Out in Chilliwack, we worked on the Vedder River, Chilliwack River, and one of the fun things about this river specifically is it's actually considered a creek, so it's tighter, it's narrower, steep drops, big rocks, really spicy rapids. You use smaller rafts as well, and differently than what you might have seen, the big rafts with the oars and the guide in the middle who can pretty much control the whole thing, and clients just have paddles for show. We use small rafts that you really depend on the rafters, your clients, to like get you down the river safely, and you're at the back with like a tiny little piece of plastic, like barely ruddering. And so you have to work as a team. Like I get to be the captain, but I really am dependent on the clients in the raft. So one big long weekend, fun weekend, sun was out, water was at a good high, perfect level, so everything was running. We had over a dozen rafts worth of guests had come out to the ranch, ready to go. There's bachelorette parties, birthday parties, company trips. There was I distinctly remember this one, there's a group of like, past middle age is like the least offensive way to say it, ladies who wanted to prove something still. Just wanted to take life by the horns. They were there too. There was what had always come out actually a lot, this company, Events and Adventures Vancouver, so a bunch of like singles on blind dates. Don't go rafting as a blind date, by the way. You're in wetsuits and big gross life jacket, and you often say and do stupid stuff, and somebody cries. It's embarrassing. But yeah, so everybody had come out, and they signed up for the hardest section of the river, the canyon. Super fun, is exciting. So we had like 14, 15 rafts. We had to get down this section of river, and we all were getting assigned our different groups, and I got the group of the jocks, right? There's a bunch of these big athletic guys. They were all amped up, ready to go. They had just been partying all night. They were just stoked, like, we're going to hit this river. So I thought, sweet, this is going to be fun. I'm going to show off. It's going to be awesome, right? So good trip. We set off, huge trip. We're just trying to survive getting, 150 people down the river, coordinating, moving down. And the first big rapid comes up. It's called the Toilet Bowl. They'll have fun names. And a couple of rafts ahead, they missed the mark. One went over backwards, which is just a bit extra exciting. Another one went over sideways, so that's a flip, and there's swimmers everywhere, and pick them up, it's fine. And so then it's my turn, and I'm going, and we're going to take the hero line to show off. It's going to be awesome, right? So right over like the biggest peak of the rapid, and I start calling out. So we use commands. I'm like, forward paddle, right back, stop, left back. And I realized we're nowhere near where we need to be because my raft is full of drunks. So I'm stressed. I get in, I'm paddling as hard as I can. We barely get there. We just sneaked through the drop, lost one rafter because he had no balance about him, just tipped off the side. We picked him up. It was fine. So this wasn't as fun a trip as I thought it would be. We survived our way down the rapids. Got to one of the last ones near the end called RPG. All the rapids have names for a reason. If a rapid has a name, RPG stands for Rocket Propelled Guide. So it's this big steep drop that only exists at certain water levels, and when you hit it just right, it folds the raft in half really aggressively, and whoever's in the back of the boat is heading over the bow, which is usually the guide. So it's coming up, and I just thought, okay, well, let's hit it. Where's my team? They're still not even close to sober. So no amount of calling or motivating was going to prevent the massive flip that we encountered. We're flying. I'm riding this wild bull of a raft upside down, trying to survive. There's paddles and clients everywhere. And luckily, we're all coordinated, so all the other rafters and groups rescued, picked them all up. The singles party got another drunk jock. The middle-aged ladies, they rescued most of them, so they were on it. But that was a Sunday, it was a stressful Sunday, where I realized I did not have the right team with me. And in this next section of Galatians, we're in chapter 2, Paul, the author of this book, he gives us some more testimony of his journey and examples of how important it is to know who's on your team, who to listen to, who to look towards for affirmation, and who to depend on when you're about to head over a raft-folding rapid called RPG. So let's hit the text. We are in Galatians chapter 2. And if you've got your Bibles with you, turn it there. If you've got your app, open it up, Galatians 2. And we're going to be reading through that starting in verse 1. So, chapter 2, verse 1, Paul writes, "Then after 14 years, I went up again to Jerusalem, this time with Barnabas. I took Titus along also. I went in response to a revelation and meeting privately with those esteemed as leaders. I presented to them the gospel that I might preach among the Gentiles. I wanted to be sure that I was not running and had not been running my race in vain." So I want to take a moment on this. The first part right there, 14 years. So the Apostle Paul, quick recap, this is important. Apostle Paul, before he was a follower of Jesus, he actually charged after people who followed Jesus. He persecuted them, imprisoned them, sentenced them, charged them with the death penalty until he had this transformational moment. Jesus confronted him, came into his life, called out the actions of Paul's life, what he was doing. At the time, he was actually called Saul, how he's living it out. It was such a massive moment, impacted him so much. It blinded Paul temporarily. It radically altered his life so strongly that after this, Paul had dedicated his entire life to the work of Jesus and building the church. And his name changed from Saul to Paul. So now we got Paul. He's writing this letter. And if you know the story, if you've grown up with hearing this story about Paul, how often do you think of this as something that happened instantly? Paul had this massive moment. He is blind, traveled over to, the scales came off his eyes, and then he's around planting churches. But here we actually get this sense where he actually spent 14 years building and assuring and patiently working on his faith before he's actually going around claiming himself boldly as an apostle, planting churches. See, he previously lived this passion-fueled and impulsive and reactionary-based life, and he had such a radical life change. He could see where he was at previously, how blinded he was at, how focused he was in at this religious zeal that he was going against God when he actually thought he was going for God. And now he experienced this new freedom and this new redirection. He's actually close to God. And he wanted to be certain that he would not slip back into a pattern that would pull him away from God's truth. So Paul made all these efforts to guard against living a pointless life, living any life that wasn't exactly what God wanted him to be doing. He says, not running this race in vain. Because for Paul, if he wasn't living out his designed purpose in God's eyes, there was no point in doing anything. Why bother? So Paul spent 14 years on this, not being inactive and doing nothing, but being patient and contemplative, being humble, developing and carefully discerning his role in this whole thing called Christianity in life. This is a thing that my generation, and in fact, actually, not even playing the generation game, all of us are really bad at patience. Woefully impatient, in fact. I think we always want to be at the end of something. We want to accomplish and get there and finish and do stuff. I'm a huge culprit of this. I want to be way ahead, down the road, already finished doing the stuff. And honestly, some of that, like, I often get restrained and held back, like, slow down and humble yourself a bit. That's kind of what you get right now in our world that moves so fast in this social media generation I'm hugely part of. We're all part of it now too, is we want to just be bold and upfront right now because we can do that. I don't need to develop a platform. I can tweet it, right? I can just throw something out there, unchecked stupidity, and just get there and speak it. I don't need to earn that place. And is also in part because you have this rapidly accelerating world that doesn't want to move at 2 miles an hour. There's a demand for instant decision making, and there's no room for 14 years of patient development. All of us are subject to this, and we all are affected by this, a world that thrives off impulse and reaction. And I think this is one of Satan's biggest tools that he uses in our lives all the time because it keeps our guards down. It keeps our discernment low. It keeps those skill sets from developing, and it keeps us distracted and unfocused. And what little focus we have that's left is specifically on our own comforts and needs and far away from God's needs and desire for our lives. And in fact, I think one thing we do too with this hyper-distracted world is rather than putting guards on from falling into those lifestyles, I think we actually put very little guard on returning to a life without God or stumble away from God. So here's the thing. There's a key difference I've noticed a lot with people who, so I grew up in the church, and by God's grace, it's actually an amazing thing. And if you talk to anybody who had a conversion later in life, they'll wish I had more years with God. But I grew up in the church, and there are people who came to know Jesus much later in life in their adult years, and there's a difference I've always noticed about them. People who came to know Jesus in their adult years, they know to put up guards against never returning to that previous life because they know what it was like without God. But then if you've grown up in the church, in fact, sometimes you don't put that same kind of effort in. And in fact, sometimes there's almost a bit of like a subtle infatuation with a rebellious life. Mostly you don't put that kind of effort into like falling away from God. Actually, this is a thing that scares me raising a pastor's kid. The stats are not in my favor. You just become so complacent and easy and sometimes just like infatuated doing anything different. But often what happens is little areas of our life that we think we're actually keeping from God, that we are lying to ourselves thinking that, we can just keep this separate and hidden, whether it's just addictions or lust or pornographic fantasies or money. Maybe you've heard the story about the guy who got baptized but kept his wallet out of the water, or our phone, maybe. We try to keep these things from God, and we actually put effort into guarding those things from God rather than guarding our faith and our relationship with God from the rest of the world, from things like the wallet. That should be the first thing that hits into the baptism tank. So Paul, instead of this like rapid, high-paced world, shows us a different example by his own testimony, his own lifestyle of playing the slow game, playing defense instead of offense. Defense is inherently a little bit of a slower focus. It's a bit more thoughtful. And so Paul spends 14 years strengthening and supporting an ironclad and robust, humble, defended faith in Jesus alone, all before moving into an authoritative role of influence. He was marked by humility in this, and when his previous life was marked by boastful religious zeal. And when he was focused in on that, God came in and crushed him. So what we can learn from that is to take Paul's example and start living for God in a bit more of a contemplative, not so radically, thoughtlessly loud way before God has to come in and crush us and redirect us. So back into the story there, chapter 2, 14 years. We're not going to get as far as I wanted to today. 14 years later. So 14 years later, Paul went up again to Jerusalem. This time he brought with him Barnabas, and he took Titus along also. This is actually what I want to get into today. This is something we're going to take a look at. Of note, Paul is traveling with companions. This is good. This is really, really good. From my childhood days, playing an adventure video game, The Legend of Zelda, there's a classic line that starts off. It just says, it's dangerous to go alone. Take this. You need a companion. You need to go with somebody. There's no good or effective biblical example of someone single-handedly carrying out God's work alone in this world. You need to be going with people in your life. Here's a really easy self-evaluation of character. You can do this. It's a rubric. It's really good. If you find you regularly have a hard time working with people, if you just cannot work with others, the problem is not everyone else. You need to be able to work with other people. That is a real need. We're designed to work in cooperation and collaboration. God himself is a trinity. He works in collaboration with himself. It's this big mystery. I'm not going to jump into that right now, but we're not meant to be solo hermits doing stuff. We need to be working with other people. And we need that kind of support. And now here, let's take a look at the team that Paul had built around for himself. So Barnabas. Barnabas' actual name was Joseph. The Bible always uses nicknames to confuse us, and you have to find all the different stuff. Study Bibles are helpful. I would have just read past Barnabas. It's a nice name. Barnabas was a fond nickname for Joseph that just means one who encourages, which gives us our first clue as to the kind of people that Paul had with him. An encouraging person, having somebody who focuses and has a gift for encouragement. Like, to get a nickname, the encourager, it can't just be somebody who writes a card every now and then, like a Valentine's Day card. Like, you actually powerfully have to be supportive and affirming and encouraging to keep people going. In Acts chapter 4, a few books back in the Bible, you learn too about Barnabas. He was a very generous man. In fact, he was actually a wealthy man who became a very generous man. He owned a huge chunk of land, sold it, donated all the finances to the cause of the early church. He wanted to see stuff thrive. He had his life changed by God and wanted to, that was his only priority. So he was a generous man as well. He was also a very trusting and discerning man. He saw the truth in Paul's testimony of life change before other people. In fact, other people didn't trust Paul. His previous life of violence and aggression, people said, not a chance. In fact, they had a warrant out to kill Paul. And Barnabas said, no, I think there's something to this guy's testimony. He was trusting to see people's character. He believed that God could do amazing and radical things. I know often it's sometimes my gut impulse to that, having a response like, you're way too much of a mess. God's not done working with you yet. I don't think that's where it's at. Instead, Barnabas had this sense of seeing, no, I can see God at work in you. So that's the kind of person you want on your team. And lastly, Barnabas was just simply a mature, faithful man. He joined Paul on missionary journeys, defending the truth of Jesus' gospel message, especially in particular to those who were trying to constantly return to the old way of doing faith, the old way of doing stuff before Jesus entered in and said, you've just been focusing on religion, laws, and rules, and you missed people, you missed God at work. So those are the main things that Barnabas did. You can read about those in the book of Acts, and Galatians are the biggest things you see in Paul and Barnabas' testimony. So now Titus, let's talk about Titus a bit. Titus was one of the first people to turn towards Jesus because of Paul's work in ministry, because of Paul's testimony. Back in chapter 1, Paul said, simply my life change and just telling people about the way Jesus had changed me affected so many people. They came and started praising God and they came to know Jesus. Titus was one of the first of those. Now, Titus was not a member of Judaism. God's people beforehand. He was referred to as a Greek, but that doesn't necessarily mean he was a true Greek. Often this term is just used in the Bible to mean not a Jewish person. Some scholars believe Titus was an Aramean or Assyrian, meaning that he spoke Aramaic. He often, in the different writings, we see a lot of Aramaic when Paul wrote to Titus. It gives us a good sense that the biggest point of all this being that Titus was an outsider. He had no cultural authority in Judaism. He had no religious clout. He was fresh. He was focused on God. He had this completely different worldly perspective and now had turned his life towards Jesus. And Paul brought someone like this along with him, became his effective intern, understudy, because Paul knew he needed that diversity of worldview. Still united towards the gospel, but something different. Without a doubt, without Paul along, or without Titus along with Paul on his journey, Paul's work wouldn't have been nearly as effective at communicating the gospel to so many people all around the Mediterranean, the early church. This diversity of view is something that we're especially bad at today, honestly engaging in a diversity of worldviews in our lives. I think, especially when we talk about how things should be, right? That would be, I'm not talking about just cultural. Sometimes we do little token efforts to do like cultural understandings, but seeing the world from different perspectives. Globally, we're a massive species, humanity. And again, imagine back in the day, Paul's day, 2,000 years ago, when you take somebody along with you on a journey, it's not just a Zoom Skype call, it's not just a couple days. Like this was 14 years. I don't know if that's how long Titus was along with him, but you're day and night journeying, bunking, finding a hostel, whatever, like 24/7 with somebody from a different perspective, a different worldview. Right now, our days, somebody sees something different as you throw in your AirPods, tune into whatever podcast, just consume something that just self-fulfills and gratifies confirmation bias in your own mind. It's easier than ever to just stay in a tiny bubble in our world today, having no clue or not even being allowed to or unable to see a diversity of views on social issues, on politics, on religion, on our world. This diverse point of view was key for Paul to correct what was previously an extremely narrow point of view, so narrow that it caused Paul to miss God at work, literally in front of his face, that God had to come in and intervene. And it's a key lesson for us to learn today, to correct what's in fact actually a history of division that we're pretty closely tied to as the church. We're a Mennonite church. We have Mennonite roots, Mennonite cultures. There's two kinds of Mennonites, by the way, if you hadn't known that. There's the Mennonites we are, and there's the other Mennonites. And nothing that we as a church profess or care about in any division. So close, though, the fact that just a couple generations ago, I've heard stories from my mom who grew up in a Mennonite church that was like, you do not make friends with the other Mennonites, you do not date the other Mennonites, you do not go near their church. It's a different kind of church. They have their doors open the other way, right? We find the dumbest things to make divisions about, but it's fueled by the fact that we're not willing to take understanding of a different worldview, a different perspective. Author Dr. Brene Brown, I like the way she puts it, is that our worldview is pretty set. We have to accept the fact that we all have a lens that we see the world through. And it's hard to change that. In fact, you can't just lie to yourself and force a change. But what you can do is honor other perspectives and find the value and truth in them. We need to actually be able to see stuff from a diverse point of view. Christianity was not an American thing, by the way. It was a Middle Eastern thing that went into all of the Mediterranean and then into the African stuff. It didn't start in England or Europe or Canada. It's traveled the world several times. It has so many different factors and influences that we need to understand. So Paul brought this along. Also, good things to keep in mind as we're searching for a lead pastor, too. You don't want yourself in the mirror only. You need some diversity. Paul brought with him Barnabas and Titus, an encourager, gifted encourager, trusting, faithful, discerning, patient, generous people, and some diversity, dynamic worldviews and experiences. So that was the team Paul had with him at this point. So continuing on in verse 3, yet not even Titus, who was with me, was compelled to be circumcised, even though he was a Greek. This matter arose because some false believers had infiltrated our ranks to spy on the freedom we have in Jesus Christ and to make us slaves. We did not give in to them for a moment, so that the truth of the gospel might be preserved in you. Okay, I'll pick this up here just to give some context, because this will come up often in this letter. It comes up in the Bible a lot. Circumcision, simply put, it is a medical practice. In this context, specifically applies to men. Parents, you can tell your kids about it in more detail. This had a significance, though, massive cultural roots that we need to kind of read into this. Some translations don't even use the word circumcision. They just talk about the meaning instead. But circumcision was the iconic and identifying ritual of and characteristic of Jewish men. And it was something that was very uncommon or completely unheard of in other cultures of that day. It became the mark physically and metaphorically of the men of God's people, and was a ritual for men who were brought into those families as well. And as much as it can seem like a bizarre thing to have that as like the focal point for this history book, if you've taken any history classes, the reality is the majority of written history is primarily influenced, whether metaphorically or literally, like in this case, from male domination, a man's, that aside, That's just some context for this idea. What's happening here, Paul is making a clear point to the recipients of his letter, to the Christians in Galatia, and for us hearing it today. What Paul is saying here, the apostles, the people who Paul went to go meet with and gain affirmation for in his testimony and in his ministry and in his work, there's a key characteristic they had, they represented by this statement. When Paul says they didn't pressure Titus into being circumcised, they were mature in their faith. They had moved past this previous system. They'd been changed by Jesus as well, that they were past the rules and systems that had distracted people away from God, and they were ultimately focused on the relationship with Jesus. They were marked by a life transformed by Jesus, and they understood and put into practice Paul's clear point in Galatians, that Jesus plus nothing. There's nothing that inhibits you from experiencing Jesus or hearing the gospel. You don't need to be a certain way or have gone through these certain rituals for Jesus to come into your life. And furthermore, Paul even goes on to say that there are literally people among us that might try to blend in and trick us with a different motivation. Spies, Paul calls them, false brothers in some translations. Their interest is not in our growth or in our relationship with Jesus or in our betterment. It's for their own goals, their own agendas. They trick us, they get into our lives. So that's something we need to start paying attention to. Who's on your team? The point this morning is for us to take a critical look around us, who's on our team, being aware of who we've allowed in or who we haven't allowed into our lives. People who are influencers in our lives, affirmers, supporters, people who help us along on our journeys, our paths. Maybe we're trying to overcome addictions or leave something behind or better ourselves and strengthen our marriages or our families. Who's on our team for that? Who's maybe actively working against that? The goal this morning is not to motivate you to become exclusive with people you connect with. In fact, though, people you hang out with. I believe the gospel actually commands us that we don't limit who we interact with all the time. We're supposed to be accessible to all people. We're supposed to be in relation with all people in the world. The Great Commission is to go into all of the world. But we do need to take a real look at who we allow to make that meaningful impact in our lives, who we allow to adjust our view, our worldviews. There's, again, from Dr. Brene Brown, she has this helpful little rubric in a book that I like. I think it's really applicable here. She calls it the Square Squad. And what she says, and you can physically do this, it's a good little practice. Take a 1 inch by 1 inch, it's tiny, it's like the size of a loonie, 1 inch by 1 inch, little square piece of paper, and start writing down the names of people who you would say fit that definition of being on your team in life, who actually affirms and who you would actually consider. How she even says it there is people who, if they criticized you or challenged you or celebrated you, it would matter the most. Who's the first person you would call with good news, or who's the first person you connect with bad news? You start writing those names down. And the point is, it's pretty limited space. It's not to give it defined you should only have 7 people or 5 or whatever, but there's 2 things about this. It should force you to take a consideration who actually fits into that 1 inch by 1 inch square, the Square Squad. And secondly, it should also get filled up. If you can't think of 3 people in your life that are that kind of important, you need to open yourself up more to people around you. Again, the point is not to limit who we interact with. I think one of the skills that we need to build again as a collective society, as a culture, after these couple years of social distancing, is to actually learn how to be socially present again with people. We need to open up and connect with people beyond our bubbles. That's a command, that's biblical, that's a Christian ethic, that's a helpful human need, is to actually be in relationship with people. So we need to be doing that. But I'm convinced we often open ourselves up way too much to influences and affirmations and validations from anything and everywhere all over the world, whether it's these social media things, whether it's this TV show, whether it's people who just have their life in a complete utter disaster, but they're really fun to hang out with, so we stay connected with them. We open ourselves up way too much. We make ourselves way too vulnerable with the wrong people, and we're not critical enough with who we allow on our team. What we do need to do is actually be critical with a select few people who fit some of the descriptions, like we see in Titus and Barnabas, with the apostles that Paul talks about, and not the false brothers. I fear it's fairly common that all too often we find out way too late that we're in a raft full of drunk guys when we actually need to be in the raft full of the middle-aged ladies that will actually be there for us. They made it down the river great, actually. They were perfect. But here's how we'll just end it off. The statement Dr. Brown puts it, what we need on that list are people who will love, or people who love us and will love us beyond their own agenda and own worldview, supporting us in what we need. I'm going to put it one step further back into the Bible here. The Apostle Paul writes so we're in chapter 2, verse 6 now. As for those who are held in high esteem, whatever they were makes no difference to me. God does not show favoritism, and they added nothing to my message. So this is Paul talking about when he went to meet with the apostles, and it's kind of the climax of his testimony after 14 years of journey and with Barnabas and Titus along with him, and he met the apostles, people who were directly close to, related to that. That's what apostle means, people who had directly been impacted by Jesus, like within a face-to-face kind of context. They were the early church leaders, church founders. So Paul meets with them, and here's where it caps off what he says. This is like the token validation for people who are on our side, on our team. Added nothing to my message. They fully validated this sense of Jesus plus nothing. What you need to watch out for in your life is the people who are like Jesus and do this stuff with your business. Jesus and make sure you vote this way. Jesus and make sure you focus and only hang out with these kind of people or do these kind of things to be really cool and popular and power gaining. Here, the sense is actually it's Jesus and nothing else is your guide. That's who you can fill in your life. So Paul sets by example and expresses for us to take a look at who in our lives is living out that Jesus plus nothing attitude. Who is sold out to guiding people towards God at all costs? Who is able to move past earthly titles and authority? I love that fact there where he says, whatever they were held in high esteem in the world's views. God doesn't show favoritism. It made no difference to me or to the apostles. So any of that doesn't matter, earthly titles and authorities. Instead, we need to cling to those people who fit those facts, encouragers, people who are faithful, people who can kind of see the truth past the surface, people who have a dynamic and different worldview than we experience all the time, but are still focused on the same unified goals. Cling to those people and make sure they fit into your one-by-one square. Look towards them for affirmation and guidance. And even more so, the challenge I'll leave with you this morning is to be one of those kind of people for others, to make sure that you actually are able to fit into somebody else's one-by-one square. It's not just about consuming, it's about pouring out back as well. So just going to end with that in prayer. God, thank you for the fact that you give us just by Paul's own testimony so much richness to see how we need to be living out our life, how we need to be focused on who influences us, who impacts us, God. That is so important to actually be critical, not to isolate ourselves from people in the world, God, but to take along with us people who have the best interest, people who you have also blessed and put in our lives to thrive and succeed. God, I pray that you challenge us to also be that kind of person for others in our world, God, to take a look at how we are maybe falling short, maybe how we have either intentionally, God, or unintentionally been a spy or a false witness or a false brother or sister in somebody's life, God, where we've just been distracted by our own agendas and put that onto somebody else or tried to pull them away from their good efforts. God, I pray for anybody here who's in the process of coming out of addiction or trying to work on something, improve something in their life that's trying to just better on what's going on. God, that you surround them with people who will, the right team, God, with people who will get them down the river, the rafting metaphor, but God, who will get them close to you, who will get them closer towards your goal and design for their life. God, I just pray you bless this morning that we go forward from here, living this out, God, taking a real look at who we let into our lives in these ways. God, I pray all these things in your name. Amen. All right, everyone, thanks again. See you on Wednesday for a night of prayer. Other than that, have a great week.